The Gospel of Luke is noted for giving the most compassionate presentation of Jesus. The 10 lepers, Jesus raising the son of the poor widow, Jesus from the cross saying, "Father, forgive them, they know not what they do." The parable of the compassionate father, which we will hear in our gospel next week. But while he is the most compassionate presentation of Jesus, Luke is also a gospel that pulls no punches. He's a gospel that says, "You think I've come for peace? I've come for the sword. I've come to light a fire on the earth, and I wish it were already burning." And his is the gospel that says, not "Blessed are the poor in spirit," but "Blessed are the poor, woe to the rich. Blessed are those who hunger, woe to those who are full." No spiritual talk in that one. And another example is today's gospel, in which he says, "You must hate your father and mother, or you cannot be my disciple." It's a very disconcerting passage. It's a very disconcerting teaching, and hopefully gives us pause. It does correspond to a teaching in Matthew's gospel, in which Matthew kind of lightens it up a little bit, where he says, "If you love your mother or father more than me, you are not worthy of me." He doesn't say hate, and he doesn't say you can't. He says, if you love your son and daughter, or your mother or father more than me, you are not worthy of me. Doesn't mean we are not to love. After all, Jesus says, "Love one another as I have loved you." Love your enemy. He only says honor your father and your mother. He doesn't say love your father and your mother, maybe because he knows of the dynamics of the relationship between parents and children, but we must honor father and mother. But when we look back at the time in which Jesus gave this teaching, and when both Matthew and Luke wrote their Gospels, this was a factor. This was a very reality that the people had to live. Unlike what we see today, in which it's common for us to be Christian, to raise our children in the Christian faith. We live in a Christian society, in a Western civilization built on Christianity. Back then, that was not the case. Those who would follow Jesus would be forsaking perhaps their Jewish faith that they were raised in, and especially the case after the Jewish synagogues expelled the Christians, up to which time Christianity was considered a sect of Judaism. In 85 AD, they were expelled from the synagogues, and perhaps converting to Christianity would mean forsaking one's family. More common, of course, throughout the Greco-Roman world, if one converted to Christianity, they were not coming from a Christian family, but a pagan family with pagan deities, family gods and goddesses, or the pantheon of Rome and Roman gods and goddesses, and so on. And in turning away from them to follow Christ, there was a great risk of alienation from one's family, perhaps even a risk of being disinherited by the family, because they are forsaking the family deities and the family cult of worship. So this is a very real teaching and a very real standard that Jesus is giving, a very real line drawn in the sand, that our love for Christ must have the highest priority of everything. And in embracing Christ, we must know what we are getting ourselves into so that we can finish what we started. And there's where he gets into the parable of the builder and the king. A builder who begins but doesn't have the materials to finish looks foolish. A king who declares war without an army that could possibly win the war looks foolish. Anyone who declares, yes, I'm a follower of Christ, but then didn't quite understand what they were getting into to the point that they wane or perhaps turn away, looks foolish. And in reminding us of this, Jesus would ask us the question, what are we willing to give up for the sake of the salvation that Jesus offers us? What are we willing to give up? In other places, Jesus says, if you put your hand to the plow and keep looking back, you are not fit for the kingdom of heaven. Of course, today we might see the exact opposite effect of that, where, as I said before, we're coming from a Christian background. We're living in a Christian society. Much of our civilization is built upon Christian values. To leave the Christian faith is the extraordinary action, where Christianity is now the norm. But even then, we see in our world today so many worldly and secular value systems that bombard us. The internet and mass media are constantly hitting us and our children with value systems that are contrary to the faith. And for many, there is the great temptation to be trendy, to go with the times, to be politically correct, and in doing so forsaking the faith that we profess. And while we, at the time of Christ, might be asked the question, what are we willing to give up to embrace the gospel, to embrace Christ? Today the question might be, what and for whom are you willing to give up your salvation, to lose your salvation? For what and for whom are you willing to put Jesus in the back seat? And there can be many examples. Oftentimes communities will say, well, these are community values. We believe in San Francisco values, or Marin County, Mill Valley values, California values. But as Catholics, how do we place our Catholic values? First and foremost, or the back seat? Over the last couple of years, one big pressure, and a legitimate one, and a concern for many of us, has been the COVID pandemic, for which many still live their lives as followers of Christ, coming to worship or not coming to worship based on a concern, either a legitimate concern or an irrational fear of a virus, in which perhaps we need to remind ourselves, ours is a church of Christ, not a church of COVID. In the last week, if we've watched the news, and in the weeks and couple months to come in a political year, for many of us, our political viewpoints are very strong, and sometimes our Catholic values take a back seat to our political leanings, our political affiliations. And perhaps when we hear a homily or a message in a gospel that touches us and challenges our own worldly values, be they secular, political, or other worldly concerns, our reaction perhaps wouldn't be, well, there Father goes again, he's getting political in his homily. Or there it is again, the gospel is getting political, and we shouldn't touch politics. Those who think that really need to get out more. Or are we asking ourselves, what does Jesus want us to hear in this? How is he challenging the worldly influences that may be influencing us or our children? How are we causing Jesus to take a back seat to other value systems we embrace? And Jesus says the same thing. If you love these more than you love him, then we are not worthy of him. Or, in today's harsh rhetoric of Luke's gospel, we must hate them, or we can't be his disciples. In short, we must love them less than we love Jesus. Let Jesus be that priority in our lives. And it's a question that we ask ourselves. How do we, all of us, myself included, put worldly concerns, worldly values before the gospel? And we've got many pressures that are presented to us to do just that. How many of us have had children who have left the faith because of worldly value systems, political correctness, wanting to be trendy, wanting to be with the times? But Jesus reminds us, he and his values, his gospel, must be the priority. And in professing a faith in Christ, we must know what we are getting ourselves into. Because we could open ourselves up to ridicule, to persecution, to being thought less of or being less sophisticated, less with the times. We must be able to finish what we started in professing that faith in Christ, so that perhaps one day by the grace of God, and by the worship we give to God here in the receiving of this Eucharist, we may one day hear Christ say, "Yes, you are truly worthy of me, because you have loved me above all things."